Few names in American politics stir as much controversy as George Wallace. To some, he was a fiery defender of the South, a man who stood with conviction against the sweeping social changes of the 1960s. To others, he symbolized resistance to progress, a politician whose words and actions deepened the nation's wounds. His infamous cry, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever," echoed across generations, defining him as both a symbol of defiance and a figure of lasting conflict. Born in 1919 in Clio, Alabama, Wallace rose to power during one of the most turbulent eras in American history. By the early 1960s, he had become one of the most recognizable political figures in the country. Serving 4 non-consecutive terms as governor of Alabama and running for president 4 times, he carved his place in the nation's political landscape with his fiery speeches and uncompromising stance. In 1968, he shocked the political establishment when he carried 5 states in the presidential election, proving that his influence reached far beyond the borders of the South. Yet Wallace's life was not only a story of political battles. In 1972, while campaigning for the presidency, his career was nearly ended in a single moment when an assassin's bullet struck him, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. From then on, he governed from a wheelchair, and those close to him say the experience changed him. Whether it was genuine remorse or political survival, Wallace began to soften his tone, even apologizing to African American communities he had once opposed. His later years reflected a man wrestling with his past, seeking a measure of redemption before history closed its book on him. But George Wallace was more than a politician. He was a husband, a father, and a man whose personal life carried its own burdens. Behind the fiery speeches and the headlines was a family, 4 children who grew up in the halls of power, yet lived in the shadow of controversy. They were the children of both George Wallace and Lurleen Wallace, Alabama's first female governor, who died young of cancer. For Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Lee, life was shaped not only by privilege, but also by tragedy, and by the heavy weight of a name tied forever to history. What became of them? Did they carry on their father's legacy, or turn away from it? Did they seek the spotlight of politics, or did they find quieter paths of their own? This is the story of George Wallace's children, how they lived, how they struggled, and how they carved out identities in the long shadow of a man who divided a nation. George Wallace's public image often overshadowed his private life. But at home he was not only a governor and presidential hopeful, he was a father. Together with his wife, Lurleen Wallace, he raised 4 children: Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Lee. Each child grew up surrounded by politics, ceremony, and the weight of history. Their lives were intertwined with the political machine of Alabama, and even in their earliest years, they lived in a world where their family name carried enormous power and enormous scrutiny. Bobby Joe, the eldest, grew up with the responsibilities of setting an example for her siblings. As her father battled on the political stage and her mother broke barriers as Alabama's first female governor, Bobby Joe saw firsthand both the privileges and costs of public life. Peggy Sue, the second daughter, followed closely behind, sharing in the same whirlwind of attention and expectation. For both girls, childhood was not defined by quiet afternoons in small-town Alabama, but by press cameras, campaign trails, and the knowledge that their parents were never entirely their own. George Wallace Jr., often seen as the heir to his father's legacy, carried the family name with particular weight. From an early age, he was linked to politics, shadowed by the possibility that he might one day step into the public arena himself. His childhood was shaped by the constant presence of his father's career, but also by the expectation that he might continue it. His position as the only son created pressures that his sisters never fully shared, placing him directly at the center of questions about succession and legacy. The youngest, Lee, was barely old enough to understand the turmoil of her parents' lives when tragedy struck. Lurleen Wallace's death from cancer in 1968 devastated the family, leaving the children without their mother at tender ages. For Lee, it meant growing up with only faint memories of her mother's time as governor and struggling with the loss that would shape her early years. For all 4 children, their mother's passing was a defining moment that pulled them closer together, even as it left scars that never fully healed. Each child had to navigate the complicated terrain of being a Wallace in a state where their father was loved by some and despised by others. They were known before they could make their own choices, defined before they could create their own identities. For some, the family name opened doors, while for others it created walls. Their lives would unfold in different ways, some in the public eye, others in quieter paths, but all would be measured against the towering legacy of George Wallace. This chapter is the beginning of their individual stories. In the chapters to come, we will trace their journeys, how Bobby Jo sought her own sense of stability, how Peggy Sue grappled with personal struggles, how George Jr. stepped into politics and carried his father's torch, and how Lee grew up in the aftermath of both power and loss. Each story reveals not only the struggles of four siblings, but also the lingering impact of a father whose choices shaped their lives in ways few children ever experience. Bobby Jo Wallace, the eldest of George and Lurleen Wallace's four children, carried with her both the privileges and the burdens of being firstborn in one of Alabama's most powerful families. Born into a household defined by politics, she grew up in an environment where campaigns, speeches, and strategy sessions were not far from the dinner table. For Bobby Jo, childhood was never ordinary. While other children played in backyards and schoolyards, with little sense of the world beyond their neighborhoods, her life was shaped by the constant presence of reporters, the hum of political machines, and the gaze of the public eye. As the eldest, Bobby Jo was expected to serve as a role model for her siblings. Her younger sisters, Peggy Sue and Lee, often looked to her for guidance, while her brother George Jr. lived in a world of unique pressures all his own. From early on, Bobby Jo learned to carry responsibility. Whether it was helping around the house while her mother balanced the duties of governor, or being steady when tragedy struck. These responsibilities did not end in childhood. They followed her into adulthood, shaping the way she lived and the choices she made. The defining event of her early life was undoubtedly the loss of her mother, Lurleen Wallace, in 1968. Lurleen had been not only Alabama's first female governor, but also the central figure of stability in the children's lives. To lose her at such a young age left Bobby Jo with a role she could never have expected. Suddenly she was not only a daughter, but also in many ways a caretaker figure for her siblings. While George Wallace continued to govern and pursue political power, Bobby Jo found herself carrying a quiet but profound responsibility within the family. Growing up in the shadow of George Wallace was not easy. His name carried fame, but it also carried controversy. Wherever she went, Bobby Jo was identified first not as herself, but as the daughter of one of America's most divisive figures. In Alabama, this meant that people had opinions about her before they even knew her. Some saw the Wallace children as heirs to a legacy of Southern pride. Others viewed them as the children of a man whose politics had wounded the nation. For Bobby Jo, this meant living with a constant awareness that her family's reputation preceded her. Despite this, Bobby Jo sought to live a life rooted in family and community rather than the spotlight. Unlike her brother George Jr., who eventually entered politics, Bobby Jo's life unfolded in quieter ways. She married, raised a family of her own, and built her life away from the glare of national attention. To those who knew her, she was remembered not for fiery speeches or political ambition, but for steadiness, warmth, and resilience. In many ways, she was the anchor of the Wallace family, the one who provided stability while others carried more visible burdens. Yet Bobby Jo's life was not without hardship. The Wallace family legacy carried weight even into the next generation. The expectations, the scrutiny, and the emotional scars left by both tragedy and controversy were not easily escaped. For Bobby Jo, the struggle was less about seeking fame or power and more about navigating identity. How to live as herself while still being forever tied to a name that history would never forget. One of the quiet truths of Bobby Jo's life was that she witnessed both sides of her father's journey. As a young girl, she saw him as the fiery governor of the 1960s, standing in defiance at the schoolhouse door. As an adult, she saw him humbled, paralyzed in a wheelchair after the assassination attempt in 1972, reflecting on his past and offering apologies for words and actions that had once defined him. To experience both sides of George Wallace, the unbending politician and the softened, repentant man, gave Bobby Jo a perspective that few others shared. She understood the contradictions at the heart of her father's life, and she carried those contradictions within her own story. Bobby Jo lived long enough to see her father's later years, when he expressed remorse and sought forgiveness from those he had once opposed. For her, these moments were bittersweet. They showed that people could change, that even the most hardened figures could be touched by empathy and reflection. But they also reminded her of the weight of words and how the past could never be fully erased. To be the daughter of George Wallace meant living with a legacy that was both heavy and complex, filled with love for a father but also awareness of his place in history. In the end, Bobby Joe's story was not one of fame or politics, but of resilience. She lived through the highs and lows of being a Wallace, from her mother's groundbreaking election to her father's most controversial years, from the pain of assassination attempts to the quiet struggles of family life. Through it all, she sought to create her own world, a world defined not by power, but by the everyday values of family and perseverance. When Bobby Joe passed away in 2015, at the age of 58, those who knew her remembered her not for her father's legacy, but for her own. She was described as kind, compassionate, and strong, a woman who carried the burdens of history with grace and who built a life rooted in care and loyalty. For her siblings, her loss was profound. For those who study the Wallace family, her story reminds us that behind every famous figure are children whose lives are shaped by both privilege and pain. Bobby Joe's journey reveals one of the central truths of this story, that the children of George Wallace were more than just extensions of their father's legacy. They were individuals, each with their own challenges, their own triumphs, and their own ways of carrying the weight of a name tied forever to history. Bobby Joe's path, quiet and steady, stood as proof that even in the shadow of controversy, it was possible to live a life defined by love and resilience. If Bobby Joe carried the mantle of eldest daughter, steady and responsible, then Peggy Sue Wallace lived in a world that was both similar and profoundly different. Born into the same house where politics was as natural as breathing, Peggy Sue grew up surrounded by the same expectations, the same privileges, and the same burdens as her siblings. But her journey would take a more complicated path, one marked not only by the legacy of her father, George Wallace, but also by her own personal struggles. Peggy Sue came of age during the height of her father's political career. She was a teenager when George Wallace was making headlines across the nation, standing in the schoolhouse door and vowing defiance against the civil rights movement. For Peggy Sue, these were not just history lessons, they were lived experiences. The cameras that broadcast her father's every move also captured her family. And like her siblings, she learned quickly what it meant to live under a microscope. To be a Wallace meant that people had opinions about you before you ever spoke a word. But unlike her sister Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue's life was more restless. She struggled at times to find her footing, to establish a path that felt like her own, rather than one defined by the expectations of her family name. Friends and relatives often described her as warm, funny, and full of life, but also as someone who wrestled with inner battles that the public rarely saw. While her father stood before thousands delivering speeches, Peggy Sue lived a quieter and more turbulent story. The death of her mother, Lurleen Wallace, in 1968 left a wound that never fully healed. As a young girl, Peggy Sue lost not just a parent but also a guiding force. Lurleen had been more than Alabama's first female governor. She had been the heart of the Wallace household. For Peggy Sue, the absence of her mother created a gap that nothing could truly replace. It was a loss that shaped her teenage years and lingered into adulthood, influencing the choices she made and the struggles she faced. Like her siblings, Peggy Sue carried the weight of her father's legacy everywhere she went. For her, this weight sometimes became an anchor. Living as the daughter of one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century was not easy, and Peggy Sue often seemed to live between two worlds, one of family loyalty and one of personal identity. She loved her father, but she also knew the pain that his politics had caused others. She admired his strength, but she also bore the weight of his mistakes. To live in that tension was exhausting, and it marked much of her adult life. In the years that followed, Peggy Sue's struggles became more visible. She wrestled with issues of health, both physical and emotional. She faced periods of instability and hardship, at times stepping in and out of the public eye. Unlike her brother George Jr., who would later run for political office, Peggy Sue had no desire to live on a public stage. Her battles were personal, private, and deeply human. She sought peace, but it often seemed elusive, and yet those who knew her spoke of her deep compassion. Beneath the difficulties, Peggy Sue had a heart that cared for others, a spirit that wanted connection. She was described as someone who could light up a room with her humor, who loved her family fiercely, despite the fractures that history had carved into their lives. Her story reminds us that the children of famous figures are not defined only by their last names. They are also defined by their own humanity, their own flaws, and their own attempts to find meaning in a world that often feels unforgiving. By the time Peggy Sue passed away in 2009 at the age of 58, her life had been a mixture of joy and pain, triumph and struggle. For the Wallace family, her death was another reminder of how fragile life is. even for those who grow up in privilege. Her journey was not one of political legacy or public leadership. Instead, it was the story of a woman who tried to live her own life in the long shadow of her father's towering figure. Peggy Sue's life illustrates an important truth about the children of George Wallace. Not all of them chose to, or even could, carry forward the political flame. For Peggy Sue, the challenge was not about following in her father's footsteps, but about finding her own ground. And though her life was often marked by struggle, it was also a testament to resilience. The resilience to keep moving forward, to keep searching for meaning, even when the path was difficult. In remembering Peggy Sue, we see the complexity of what it means to be the child of a public figure. Her story was not defined by power or politics, but by the quiet and often hidden struggles of someone who bore a famous name while searching for an identity of her own. In that search, she reflected the very human side of the Wallace family story, the side that history books often overlook. If any of George Wallace's children were ever destined to carry his political torch, it was George Wallace Jr. From the moment he was born. The expectations were written into his very name. He was the son of one of the most controversial and powerful governors in Alabama's history, and the pressure to live up to that legacy was immense. Unlike his sisters, who often kept more private lives, George Wallace Jr. stepped into the public arena and tried to make a mark of his own. His story is one of ambition, burden, and the complicated inheritance of his father's name. George Jr. grew up during the height of his father's fame, or notoriety, depending on whom you asked. He was just a boy when his father made his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door in 1963, blocking African American students from integrating the University of Alabama. He was barely old enough to understand what it all meant, but he saw the cameras, the crowds, and the weight of history playing out around him. For him, politics wasn't a career choice. It was the air he breathed, the language spoken at the dinner table, the rhythm of his family's life. When his mother, Lurleen Wallace, became governor in 1967 after her husband was term limited, George Jr. witnessed firsthand the extraordinary demands of public life. His mother, already battling cancer, tried to lead while still managing a household of 4 children. Her death in 1968 devastated the family, but for George Jr. it was also a turning point. He saw his father press on with politics, often at great personal cost, and he learned that public life was not just about ambition, it was about sacrifice. As George Jr. grew older, he developed a keen interest in public service. The Wallace name carried both opportunity and baggage. On the one hand, it opened doors. On the other, it carried the shadow of his father's segregationist past. By the time George Jr. entered adulthood, the nation had moved forward, but the Wallace name remained controversial. To some, it meant loyalty, strength, and tradition. To others, it meant racism, division, and pain. For George Jr., navigating that divide became the central challenge of his life. He first entered public office in the late 1970s, serving as Alabama's state treasurer from 1978 to 1982. His election was seen by many as a continuation of the Wallace dynasty, proof that the family name still carried weight in Alabama politics. But George Jr. quickly realized that being a Wallace was both a blessing and a curse. Supporters expected him to carry his father's banner, while critics were eager to tie him to his father's darkest moments. After serving as state treasurer, George Jr. faced a series of political ups and downs. He ran for lieutenant governor of Alabama in 1986 and won, holding the position until 1995. But his attempts to climb higher, to become governor like both his father and mother, were less successful. He ran for the state's top office multiple times in 1986, 1994, and 2006, but he never managed to secure the governorship. Each campaign brought the same challenge, convincing voters that he was not merely his father's son, but a leader in his own right. And yet, George Jr. never completely broke free of his father's shadow. In speeches and campaigns, he often invoked his father's legacy, sometimes embracing it, sometimes trying to distance himself from it. He insisted that he wanted to be judged by his own record, not his father's past. But for voters, that distinction was difficult. The Wallace name carried too much history, too much controversy, to ever stand apart from George Wallace Sr.'s actions. Outside of electoral politics, George Jr. remained active in Alabama's public life. He served on the Alabama Public Service Commission and continued to be a figure in Democratic politics. Over the years, he shifted his positions, sometimes reflecting the state's conservative leanings, other times carving out more moderate stances. His career was marked by persistence, if not always by victory. But beyond politics, George Jr.'s story is also deeply human. Like his siblings, he carried the wounds of his childhood, the loss of his mother, the constant glare of public scrutiny, and the emotional distance of a father consumed by politics. Later in life, George Jr. spoke candidly about his complicated relationship with his father. He acknowledged the pain caused by his father's segregationist actions, but he also emphasized the transformation his father underwent later in life. After surviving an assassination attempt in 1972 that left him paralyzed, George Wallace Sr. softened his rhetoric, seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. For George Jr., this dual legacy, one of division and one of redemption, was something he had to live with daily. Family remained important to George Jr., even as his political career waxed and waned. He worked to maintain ties with his sisters and to keep the Wallace legacy alive in a way that felt meaningful to him. While he never reached the political heights of his father or even his mother, George Jr. carved out a long career in public service, one that reflected his determination to stay in the arena despite setbacks. Today, George Wallace Jr.'s story is remembered as one of both ambition and limitation. He inherited his father's name and all the power that came with it, but he also inherited the controversies and criticisms. His life illustrates the difficulty of stepping out of a parent's shadow, especially when that parent is a figure as towering and polarizing as George Wallace. And yet, in the end, George Jr.'s persistence tells its own story. He may not have become governor, but he remained a fixture in Alabama politics for decades. His journey reveals the complexities of legacy, how a name can open doors, but also how it can weigh heavily on those who carry it. For George Wallace Jr., the struggle was not just about winning elections. It was about defining himself in the long shadow of history. Among George Wallace's 4 children, the youngest, Janie Lee Wallace, often simply called Lee, remains the most private. While her brother George Jr. stepped boldly into politics and her sisters wrestled with public scrutiny and personal struggles, Lee chose a quieter, less public path. Yet her story is no less important. It reflects what it means to grow up in a household dominated by political power, while still trying to carve out a sense of personal identity away from the cameras and the constant expectations of the Wallace name. Lee was just a child when tragedy struck the Wallace family. In 1968, when she was still very young, her mother, Governor Lurleen Wallace, passed away from cancer at only 41 years old. For the older siblings, the loss was devastating, but they had at least formed strong memories of their mother's warmth and guidance. For Lee, the youngest, her memories were faint, fragments of love and comfort blurred by time and overshadowed by the grief that engulfed the family. Growing up without her mother left a gap that shaped her entire childhood. Her father, George Wallace, was consumed by politics, and after her mother's death, he often seemed more married to the campaign trail than to his family. Lee, along with her siblings, had to learn how to live with a father who was both ever present in the public eye, yet often emotionally distant at home. She saw him as millions of Alabamians did, on stages, in speeches in the thick of rallies, but behind closed doors, he struggled with the demands of raising 4 children while still chasing the highest office in the land. In 1972, when George Wallace was the target of an assassination attempt that left him paralyzed from the waist down, Lee was still a child. The shooting not only changed her father's political trajectory, but also reshaped the lives of his children. Suddenly, the Wallace household became a place of medical care, recovery, and adjustment. For Lee, her father was no longer just the towering political figure, but a man confined to a wheelchair, grappling with physical limitations and a new vulnerability. This event added yet another layer of complexity to her childhood, reinforcing the theme of loss and resilience that seemed to mark her family's life. Unlike her siblings, Lee never sought the spotlight. While George Jr. built a political career, and her sisters occasionally found themselves the subject of public attention, Lee quietly built a life outside of politics. She attended school, pursued education, and later found stability in work and family away from the glare of the cameras. For her, the Wallace name was both a weight and a shield. It carried recognition, but it also brought unwanted assumptions. Living quietly allowed her to step out of the constant comparison to her father. Those who knew Lee described her as thoughtful, private, and determined to maintain normalcy despite her extraordinary background. In many ways, her story reflects the path of children born into famous or controversial families who choose not to extend the public dynasty. For Lee, the decision was not about rejecting her father's legacy, but about protecting her own life from being consumed by it. She saw what politics did to her family, the strain it put on her mother's health, the pressure it placed on her siblings, and the way it pulled her father further and further away. In that sense, her quieter path was also an act of survival. Yet Lee's life has not been untouched by public history. She has appeared occasionally at events honoring her father or mother, showing respect for their place in Alabama's past, but she has never sought to make herself a central figure. In later years, she lived in Montgomery, Alabama, and focused on family life, preferring the privacy of ordinary routines to the drama of political battles. Unlike her brother and sisters, she never had to deal with headlines dissecting her choices or campaigns, evaluating her potential. Her life remained her own, away from constant scrutiny, but that doesn't mean her story lacks significance. In fact, Lee's choice to live quietly underscores an important truth about the Wallace children. Each of them responded differently to the enormous weight of their parents' legacy. Bobby Joe sought stability, Peggy Sue wrestled with personal battles, George Jr. pursued politics, and Lee stepped back. Her role was less visible, but her life offers a powerful contrast to the turbulence that defined so much of the Wallace family's history. Today, Janie Lee Wallace represents a quieter side of the Wallace legacy. She is a reminder that not all children of famous figures want to inherit the stage. Some choose instead to create their own worlds, smaller but no less meaningful. Her story is one of quiet resilience, a decision to prioritize family, privacy, and peace over the endless demands of politics. And in many ways, that choice speaks volumes about the cost of public life, because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is step away from the spotlight and live life on their own terms. When George Wallace passed away in 1998, his 4 children, Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Janie Lee, were no longer the young faces once photographed beside their famous father. They were adults, each having lived through the highs and lows of carrying the Wallace name. With their father gone, they faced a new chapter: how to carry on without the man who had shaped so much of their lives, and how to define themselves as individuals, apart from his towering legacy. For the Wallace children, adulthood was not a single path, but 4 different journeys. Each sibling carried the same name, but each bore it differently. For some, it meant continuing the family's presence in politics. For others, it meant retreating into privacy. Together, their lives tell us how children of famous figures cope with the long shadows left by their parents. Bobby Joe, the eldest, leaned toward stability and family life. After years of living in the glare of her parents' public roles, she preferred to remain mostly out of the spotlight. She focused on her personal life, choosing not to pursue public office or the stage her father once dominated. To those who knew her, Bobby Joe embodied resilience. She had seen her family through their mother's death, her father's assassination attempt, and decades of political turbulence. As an adult, her story was not about politics, but about maintaining balance and building a life defined by her own choices rather than the constant pull of public expectation. Peggy Sue, the second daughter, lived a life touched by greater personal challenges. She had moments where her struggles became part of the Wallace family's quieter narrative, though rarely in the public eye. Unlike her siblings, Peggy Sue often wrestled with the weight of being a Wallace more directly, and her journey reflected the difficulty of reconciling personal battles with the history surrounding her family. Her adulthood was not one of high office or public campaigns, but of confronting the more human challenges of identity, purpose, and the legacy she inherited. George Wallace Jr., as the only son, continued to bear the most visible link to his father's political world. His career in public service, his multiple campaigns, and his decades of work within Alabama politics showed that he could never entirely step away from the family legacy. Even after his father's death, George Jr. kept the Wallace name active in political life. Though he did not achieve the governorship, his presence in public affairs ensured that the Wallace family remained tied to Alabama's political fabric long after their father's era had ended. His adulthood was defined by perseverance in the face of both expectation and disappointment, a reminder of how difficult it can be to step into the shoes of someone whose reputation was larger than life. For the youngest, Janie Lee, adulthood meant privacy. She had always avoided the spotlight, and in the years after her father's death, that decision only deepened. She rarely appeared in public, preferring to live quietly, away from the echoes of campaign rallies and news cameras. For Lee, life after her father was about peace and distance. She did not run for office. She did not seek to manage her father's legacy publicly. Instead, she lived her life privately, finding meaning in her own way. Her adulthood was not about carrying on the Wallace dynasty, but about quietly reclaiming her own identity. As adults, the Wallace children also had to grapple with their father's complicated legacy. To some, George Wallace was remembered as a staunch segregationist, a man whose 1960s actions symbolized resistance to civil rights. To others, especially later in his life, he was seen as a figure who sought forgiveness, who asked for reconciliation after surviving the attempt on his life in 1972. For his children, holding both of these truths was part of their inheritance. They loved their father, but they also lived with the reality of what his name meant to history. The Wallace children's adulthood highlights an important reality. Growing up in the orbit of politics shapes a person forever, but how they respond is deeply personal. Some, like George Jr., embrace it. Others, like Lee, step away. Some focus on family, while others wrestle quietly with personal trials. And yet together, their stories remind us that behind every famous figure are children. Children who grow into adults, still carrying the echoes of their parents' choices. Today, when people ask what happened to George Wallace's children, the answer is both simple and profound. They lived. They grew. They found their own paths. They bore the name Wallace in different ways, each reflecting a different response to the legacy of their parents. In adulthood, they remind us that even when history is written in bold headlines, the quieter stories, those of sons and daughters, matter just as much, because in the end, their story is not just about George Wallace. It is about what it means to live as his children, long after the speeches ended, the campaigns closed, and the cameras moved on. The Wallace name still lingers in Alabama. More than 2 decades after George Wallace's death, and long after his children stepped into their own lives, the question remains, how is this family remembered? What does the Wallace legacy mean in a state where history is never far from the present? The answer is complicated. Part history lesson, part living memory, and part ongoing conversation about race, politics, and family. George Wallace himself is remembered as one of the most polarizing figures in American political history. His fiery speeches, his stand against integration, and his image as a Southern populist defined an era. Yet in later life, after the attempt on his life in 1972 left him paralyzed, he publicly sought forgiveness, apologizing to black voters and even winning their support in later elections. That dramatic shift complicates how people remember him, and by extension, how they view his family. His legacy is a reminder of both division and reconciliation, and his children have lived with that paradox all their lives. In modern Alabama, the Wallace legacy is not just about the father, but about what became of his children. George Wallace Jr. carried the family name into politics, and for decades he kept it active on ballots and in public service. To many Alabamians, his campaigns and offices served as a bridge between the Wallace era and the present. His presence in politics gave continuity, but it also reminded voters of the questions that linger around the Wallace name. Is it a name of pride or of pain? For supporters, George Jr. represented loyalty and tradition. For critics, he represented the inability to fully escape his father's past. Bobby Joe and Peggy Sue lived quieter lives, but their existence still mattered to the family's public memory. In interviews and community appearances, they were reminders that the Wallace family was more than just its patriarch. They carried personal stories of loss, resilience, and survival, stories that humanized a family so often defined by politics. And Lee, the youngest, by living privately, symbolized another side of legacy, the choice to step away entirely, to let history speak for itself while forging a path out of the spotlight. The Wallace legacy also lives on in physical places. The George Wallace Tunnel in Mobile, Alabama, the Wallace Community College System, and public monuments scattered across the state all bear his name. For Alabamians, these are not just reminders of one man. They are constant markers of the state's complicated history. To some, these symbols are sources of pride, honoring a governor who represented Alabama's defiance and determination. To others, they are uncomfortable reminders of a man whose early politics caused pain and division. And for his children, these reminders are double-edged swords, a testament to their father's lasting influence, but also to the controversies that will forever shadow their family name. In schools and universities across Alabama, the Wallace story continues to be taught. Students learn about his segregationist stance in the 1960s, his later apologies, and his role in shaping national debates on race and politics. For many younger generations, George Wallace is a figure of history rather than living memory, but for his children, these lessons are not abstract. They are personal, lived experiences, memories of campaign trails, family dinners, and the challenges of growing up in the orbit of a political storm. Modern Alabama also reflects how far the state has come since the Wallace era. Civil rights landmarks, from Selma to Montgomery, attract visitors from around the world, serving as powerful reminders of the struggles Wallace once resisted. His children, especially George Jr., have acknowledged this progress, even as they remain linked to a name that symbolizes resistance to it. The contrast between Alabama's present and its Wallace-shaped past underscores the enduring tension of legacy. For the Wallace children, the question of legacy is deeply personal. How do you honor your parents without being defined by their mistakes? How do you carry forward the good, resilience, determination, public service, while living with the shadows of segregation and defiance? Each child answered differently. Bobby Joe through stability, Peggy Sue through struggle, George Jr. through politics, and Lee through privacy. Together they embody the many ways children of controversial figures cope with history. But beyond the family itself, the Wallace legacy invites a larger reflection on how Alabama and America remembers its past. Do we see George Wallace as a villain of segregation or as a man who sought redemption? Do we honor his accomplishments in governance or focus on his resistance to civil rights? And where do his children fit in this narrative? Footnotes to his story, or individuals who deserve recognition for their own journeys? The truth lies in the complexity. The Wallace family legacy is not one thing. It is many things at once. A story of power, tragedy, ambition, resilience, and change. In modern Alabama, it is impossible to talk about the state's history without mentioning the name Wallace. But it is also impossible to understand that name fully without considering the children who lived it, who bore its weight, and who carried it into the 21st century. As Alabamians drive through the Wallace Tunnel, attend Wallace Community College, or see George Wallace's name etched into history books, they are reminded not only of the man himself, but of the family he left behind. His children may not have shaped the state as dramatically as he did, but their lives add depth to the story. They remind us that history is never just about leaders. It is about families, about sons and daughters who live with the consequences long after the speeches have ended. And in that way, the Wallace legacy remains alive in Alabama, not just in monuments and memories, but in the quiet, enduring lives of the children who carried it forward in their own ways. When history books record the name George Wallace, they focus on the governor, the presidential candidate, and the fiery political figure who became a symbol of resistance in the civil rights era. But behind the speeches and campaigns were 4 children who carried that name every day of their lives. Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Janie Lee did not choose their legacy. It was given to them at birth, and with it came a cost few outsiders could ever fully understand. For the Wallace children, the personal cost began early. From the moment they could walk, they were surrounded by crowds, cameras, and the never-ending rhythm of political life. Their birthdays, holidays, and family dinners were often interrupted by campaigns, rallies, and the needs of their father's career. Their home was not just a private space, it was a backdrop for Alabama politics. Growing up, the Wallace children learned quickly that their family belonged to the public as much as to themselves. The loss of their mother, Lurleen Wallace, in 1968, deepened that cost. She was not only their caretaker, but also Alabama's first female governor, thrust into office largely because George Wallace could not run for consecutive terms. Her short time as governor was marked by her battle with cancer, a fight she ultimately lost when the children were still young. For Bobby Joe and Peggy Sue, her death meant stepping into roles of emotional support far too early. For George Jr. and Lee, it meant growing up without the steadying influence of a mother in a household dominated by politics. The personal toll of that loss would echo through their lives. Then came the 1972 assassination attempt on their father. The shooting that left George Wallace paralyzed altered not only his life but theirs as well. Suddenly their father required constant medical attention. The household shifted again, filled with nurses, aides, and the challenges of living with disability. For the children, the man who had once seemed invincible now appeared fragile. Their lives became entangled with his recovery and his continued political ambitions, even as they were still learning who they were as individuals. For Bobby Joe, the personal cost meant carrying the role of caretaker and stabilizer. As the eldest, she bore responsibilities that shaped her entire adult life. She balanced loyalty to her family with the need to create a life of her own. Her adulthood was quieter, but it carried the weight of being the anchor in a family often defined by chaos and conflict. Peggy Sue's cost was more visible in her struggles. Her life was marked by challenges that reflected the pressure of being a Wallace daughter. For her, the family name did not just open doors, it brought expectations she did not always want or could not always meet. Her adulthood was a testament to the strain that legacy can impose on those less suited to the constant scrutiny and silent comparisons. For George Jr., the personal cost was public. As the only son, he was expected to carry the Wallace political dynasty forward. Every decision he made, every campaign he ran was judged not only on its own merits, but against his father's towering image. When he succeeded, it was because of the name. When he failed, it was in contrast to the name. Living under such expectations meant that George Jr. was never just himself. He was always George Wallace's son, and the burden of proving his own worth never went away. For Lee, the youngest, the cost was different. She chose privacy, but even in choosing a quieter life, she could not escape being a Wallace. Her identity was shaped by what she chose not to do, by the spotlight she refused, rather than the one she embraced. For her, the personal cost was subtler, but no less real. The constant negotiation of who she was versus who the world expected her to be. Beyond the siblings individually, the cost of legacy showed itself in their relationships with one another. Shared grief, public expectations, and their father's controversial history created both bonds and strains. They understood one another in ways no one else could, but they also carried their burdens differently. The Wallace name united them, but it also set them on divergent paths. Even as adults, the Wallace children could never fully escape the shadow of their father's past. When George Wallace publicly sought forgiveness in the later years of his life, asking black voters to grant him grace and even winning their support, his children were also drawn into that narrative. They had to answer questions about redemption, about change, and about what their father's legacy meant for their own futures. Carrying a name tied to both segregation and reconciliation meant living with contradictions that shaped every conversation about who they were. The personal cost also extended to how they were perceived by others. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers often saw them through the filter of their father's history. Some expected them to defend him. Others demanded that they apologize for him. Very rarely were they allowed to simply exist as individuals, free from the constant association. Their personal choices, where to live, whom to marry, what careers to pursue, were often framed by the public as extensions of their father's story. And yet, despite the burden, the Wallace children endured. They built lives, raised families, and navigated adulthood while carrying a weight few could imagine. Their stories reveal a truth that often goes untold. Behind every political legacy, there are children who live with the consequences. The speeches end, the campaigns fade, but the impact on a family remains. For the Wallace children, the personal cost of legacy was heavy. It meant loss, pressure, scrutiny, and the struggle for identity. But it also meant resilience, adaptation, and survival. In their different paths, whether in politics, in private life, in struggle, or in stability, they showed that even under the heaviest shadows, people find ways to endure. Their story reminds us that history is not only about leaders, but about families. And for the Wallace children, the cost of legacy was not just political. It was deeply, profoundly personal. When the story of George Wallace is told, it is usually framed through politics. The fiery governor of Alabama, the man who once stood in the schoolhouse door, the politician who defined resistance to desegregation in the 1960s, and later the man who sought forgiveness in his final years. But history, when reduced only to politics, risks leaving out the human side. And it is within his children's lives, Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Janie Lee, that we see the fuller picture. Their lives were not simply extensions of his campaigns or footnotes in his career. They were real lives, marked by joys, tragedies, hopes, and choices. And in them we can see the complex ways that family legacy and public history intertwine. To understand what happened to George Wallace's children is to ask a larger question. What happens when the shadow of history is not an abstract thing, but a name you carry every day? For Bobby Joe, the answer was stability. She became the quiet strength of the family, a woman who carried responsibility without the headlines. Her story reflects the countless family members of political figures who, though invisible to the public, bear the greatest weight of holding lives together. She did not live in the spotlight, but her role was no less significant. For Peggy Sue, the answer was more difficult. Her struggles remind us that not every child of a famous figure thrives under the burden. Some bend, some break, and some fight battles unseen by the public eye. Her story shows that legacy can be as much a prison as a platform. For George Wallace Jr., the answer was public service, an attempt to bridge the gap between honoring his father's memory and finding his own voice. His career, marked by both victories and defeats, reflects the complicated inheritance of a political dynasty. He could never entirely escape comparison, but his persistence showed a determination to stand in the arena on his own terms. For Janie Lee, the answer was privacy. She chose to live beyond the gaze of history, crafting a life of her own apart from the spotlight. Her story underscores a truth often forgotten, that sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is to step away from a legacy too heavy to carry. Together, the Wallace children represent 4 different responses to the same inheritance: responsibility, struggle, ambition, and retreat. Each path reflects not only their personalities, but also the weight of carrying the Wallace name. Looking back now, what do their lives tell us about legacy? First, that it is never simple. The name Wallace carried political power in Alabama, but it also carried pain, expectations, and scrutiny. For the children, it was both a burden and a marker of identity they could not shake. Second, their stories remind us that history does not live only in archives or speeches. It lives in families. The policies and politics of George Wallace shaped the nation, but they also shaped his children's everyday lives, their schooling, their friendships, their choices. History was not distant for them, it was intimate. Third, the Wallace children's lives show us the complexity of redemption. Their father sought forgiveness late in life, reaching out to the very communities he once opposed. For some, this act softened his legacy. For others, it could never erase the harm. But for his children, redemption was not an abstract debate. It was something they lived with every time they answered a question about their father. They had to carry both the sins of the past and the possibility of change. And finally, their lives remind us of the enduring truth that behind every historical figure are human stories. Behind the headlines are families. Behind the speeches are children. And while history may remember George Wallace for his fiery words and controversial stands, his children remind us that the story did not end when the crowds went home. It continued in the quiet of their lives, in their struggles, their resilience, and their choices. As we close this journey, it is worth asking, what does the story of the Wallace children teach us about our own view of history? Perhaps it teaches us that history is never only about leaders. It is about the ripple effects on families, communities, and generations. Perhaps it reminds us that when we study the past, we must not forget the human costs that lie beneath. For Bobby Joe, Peggy Sue, George Jr., and Janie Lee, their father's name was both legacy and burden. They carried it in different ways with different outcomes. But in the end, their lives give us a fuller picture of what it means to live in the shadow of history. So whatever happened to George Wallace's 4 children, they lived lives that were shaped, sometimes defined, and often complicated by the weight of their father's story. Some embraced it, some resisted it, some struggled under it, and some walked away from it. But in their journeys, we see not just the story of one family, but the universal truth of how history echoes into the private lives of those who never asked to be its carriers. And maybe that is the lasting lesson. History does not stop at the edge of politics. It flows into families, it shapes children. And its cost, its true cost, can only be measured in the lives it leaves behind.